Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar. This is one of a series of end market that Enterprise Ireland started recently as a new investment initiative to support clients in their quest to discover, explore and develop new markets. And in our particular case, we're reviewing today the human pharma study by two consultancies on 4 markets. You saw it in the invite. Let's look at the agenda. Next, please. Just to give you a brief overview. Obviously, this is not about us; it's about the results of the study that we're all eager to hear. We'll look at the top level sort of sectorial trends, opportunities and challenges in those 4 markets: France, Belgium, UK and Switzerland. And then in another module, we'll delve deeper into how to get really into new initiatives, how to win business with preferably the larger pharma players, although tier 2 may turn out to be a very interesting additional option. And finally, the consultants will also sort of elaborate on a business roadmap, and we hopefully have 40 minutes left in the end for your question and answers. This was obviously a year, more than a year of extreme and unforeseen volatility and ensuing and fast-paced developments, particularly in this sector. By way of example, BioNTech and Moderna were a year and a half ago unknown, barely combined 200 million turnover, and now they're multi-billion-dollar companies of much relevance to the world. Moderna, together with Lonza, by way of example, is investing into COVID and new drug development. Plant builds in Switzerland for the next 5 years. They have a contract volume of 1 billion each foreseen. Moreover, of course, there are lots of effects on the market in terms of supply chain security, the whole remote patient point of care testing developments will have massive impacts on R&D and clinical trials. Also in manufacturing, you see that there's very dynamic developments in terms of small batch manufacturing, single use, digitalization, that affects predictive design or maintenance and all those things. It's actually it's quite a dynamic market situation, and so it's also maybe timely that this study coincided with that, because obviously there are many new developments to cover and to consider. Next slide, please. And the next one, the objectives, I already mentioned a little bit, trend analysis, developments in procurement policies and processes based on these changes that may trigger new approaches, investment initiatives that might be interesting, like the Moderna Lonza one, and many more in many of those 4 markets and beyond. And just to mention it, there will be certainly also second rounds of other markets, but we thought that in the Eurozone, which is one focus of Enterprise Ireland, this was a good group of countries to start with. Finally, of course, we also would like to have material that can further support our team in those markets to build on their networks and their intelligence. So I'd like to give a very heartfelt thank you to all the contributors of this team. Glenn, of course, foremost, who did most of what nobody else could have done. Selma from the Dublin side coordinating, and then our 2 colleagues, Mary Claire and Laura from the UK market, Jean-Charles from France, and Rebecca from the Benelux market. Thank you very much. Before we go on to presenting and have the consultants talk to us, I'd like to hand over to Deirdre Glenn, our Department Manager Life Sciences, to give maybe a little bit and to address you also a little bit on the bigger context of things. Thank you. Thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you, Vincent, and good morning all. Delighted to be here this morning to join you on this discussion around the opportunities within key markets for pharma. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Stuart Glenn. I'm head of life sciences within Enterprise Ireland, and I'm responsible for all of our companies growing and scaling, but also for our research and innovation agenda. So I'm going to keep this very brief. Vincent just asked me to sort of set the scene and to talk a little bit about our sector. So I'm not going to go through slides, but I suppose just in terms of the life sciences sector in Ireland, you know, Ireland has developed a well-deserved reputation as a leader in life sciences over many years, and virtually all of the top pharma and medical device companies have a presence in Ireland. But I suppose what's hugely important is that around this multinational agenda is a number of indigenous innovative companies that have emerged over the last 5-10 years, providing really vital products and services to those sectors. And it is a growing market, and when we look at our life sciences sector, our indigenous life sciences sector, it kind of breaks out between what we would call those that are supporting the pharma subsector and those that are supporting the health tech, med tech. And I suppose this morning, our key focus is looking on the pharma side. But as a totality, our sector continues to grow year on year. And in 2019, we had over 2.1 billion in exports and 2.6 billion in sales for that cohort of about 270 clients. Our clients are very R&D intensive, highly agile, flexible, resilient. Of course, our clients are very heavily regulated. From an Enterprise Ireland perspective, what's hugely important is that they're regionally dispersed. And what we mean by that is that the majority of our clients sit outside our key cities. In fact, 65% of the jobs are outside of Dublin and other key cities. Hugely important for us is the market diversification agenda for our clients and their ability to trade internationally. And I'm really looking forward to the discussions this morning around the opportunities within the 4 key Eurozone UK markets. What those of you on the call may or may not be aware of is that we have a really strong ecosystem of startups within this sector, and we've very strong links with our multinational community here in Ireland. I suppose, as we all know, it's been a period of significant change in the last year to 18 months, and I'm delighted to say that our life sciences clients, both on the medtech and the pharma side, have really stepped up to the challenge. And in terms of our response to COVID and the challenges around that, we were considered by the OECD as, you know, 5th in the world in terms of our response to COVID. If we specifically look at the key subsector around pharma and vet pharma, we kind of cluster our groups of companies into 4 key subsectors. We've got a strong cohort of chemical raw material companies, and I believe we've got Alto bioreagents on the line. A critical important component is our companies that can supply raw materials and components into the pharma industry. We've got a growing drug discovery, drug development group of companies, companies involved in the development of new therapeutics, such as Amaret Pharma and the like, but companies also involved in advanced manufacturing and cell and gene therapy, the likes of Avectus. In terms of our pharma manufacturing cohort, I suppose from an Enterprise Ireland perspective, where our clients really play is around generic manufacturing. And you may have seen the announcement in the last week, Chanel Pharmaceuticals, our largest indigenous company that once again is growing and scaling in terms of supporting generics and medicines. And so it's continuing to grow, has over 450 people now based over in Galway, with thousands of products on the market. Another up and coming star for us is Zolas Pharma, a client of ours that's involved in the novel liquid formulations for prescription medicine. So again, a critical cohort of companies. But But I suppose the focus of our discussion this morning is around what we consider the pharma services, and I say services in the broadest possible context. When we look at our cluster of companies, we really see the opportunity to grow and scale our companies that are in some way part of the supply chain in the human manufacturing agenda, be that on the research and innovation side, be that on the manufacturing side, the clinical trials side, or the commercial manufacturing. And I'm delighted to see a number of the companies on the line today that are some way supporting that human pharma manufacturing supply chain, the likes of Telegraph, High Tech Health, to name but a few. And I suppose I just mentioned the panel before we came on. Yesterday was an absolutely momentous day for Enterprise Ireland and for the Indigenous Irish pharma sector, where we announced investment into one of our key shining stars, Applied Process Company, an investment around the process development and the manufacturing of vaccines and life-saving medicines, including COVID vaccines. So this is going to be the first Indigenous Irish company that's going to have the ability, not only doing the process development and research in the space, but actually manufacturing these life-saving drugs. So a very momentous and a very, very proud day for us. And as I said, this morning's discussion couldn't come at a better time, because it's an example of the truly ambitious, innovative Irish companies that want to grow and scale internationally in supporting the pharma sector. When we look at Enterprise Ireland and when we look at our clients and we look at the last 18 months, as I mentioned, you know, it's the COVID pandemic understandably took over much of our sector, but our companies absolutely rose to the challenge and developed innovative solutions. You know, companies, I believe Aerogen may be on the line, companies such as Aerogen involved in the production of ventilators to help patients in critical and intensive care, and companies on our digital health side. Again, companies like this adapting and pivoting to respond to the challenges that we faced as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it wasn't all plain sailing, and a number of our companies that were supporting non-COVID products and services did see a downturn, and clients within our clinical trial space certainly experienced delays, as many of non-COVID clinical trials were suspended. But I'm delighted to say that they used that time to focus on digital transformation projects and to pivot into where the opportunities were. So from an Enterprise Ireland perspective, we had a significant number of supports to help our clients within the last 18 months, to help them to rapidly respond for those companies who couldn't keep up with demand. But for those companies that had challenges, liquidity challenges and market challenges, we had a raft of supports available to them. And I suppose as we look into 2021 and beyond, what we're hearing from our pharma and our medtech companies is that some of the biggest challenges that they're being faced with is around the longer term impact of COVID and what does that mean for their market. I know we've got Laura and Marie-Claire on the line here. We're looking at the fallout of Brexit, our priority market for a lot of our pharma clients, and really what does that mean. I'm delighted to say that the majority of our life sciences clients and our pharma clients in particular were well ready and prepared, but ultimately we do have challenges, particularly around supply chain, logistics, customs challenges. They do continue to cause challenges for us. But again, this is a priority for Enterprise Ireland in terms of supporting our companies, because the UK continues to be a priority market for a lot of our companies. Of course, the whole global trade agenda and the changes in regulation are something that we need to ensure our clients are ready for. And it goes without saying that, you know, climate change and sustainability is a key priority for us as we look to supporting our clients. And we've got a number of ways that Enterprise Ireland is trying to work with clients. We're trying to strengthen our Irish enterprise in response to COVID-19 and Brexit, and we're trying to drive transformational change by helping them to accelerate the innovation, their digitization agenda, their transition to a low carbon agenda. And ultimately, which Enterprise Ireland's key mandate is about helping our companies to start and to scale and to grow enterprise in export markets, including the 4 key markets today. So I suppose when we look to the next 12 to 18 months, what I would say is that, yeah, COVID-19 continues to dominate the headlines as we progress forward to the second half of this year. But we know that many of our Irish companies are responding with some truly innovative products and services and really helping to make a difference. Our companies are at the center of technology innovation and are driven, I would say, by a global mindset. And you'll see that from the number of companies that have joined us here this morning. Companies with a commercial imperative and really developing solutions to meet some of the toughest challenges that the world is facing today. What we hear time and time again is that our companies go an extra mile. They're trusted and respected by their global partners. And really for us, it's as Enterprise Ireland, every day we get up to work with these truly innovative, inspiring companies to help them on that journey. And today, I'm really, really delighted to be part of this webinar as we help these Irish companies to really, to truly understand the opportunities and the challenges within these 4 markets as we continue to try and grow and scale these ambitious Indigenous companies. I suppose the disruption of the last year has really changed the biopharma industry, particularly here in Ireland forever, and our businesses do face a new set of challenges. But I would say to the panel and to everybody, we are very clear that there are some truly innovative, resilient Irish pharma companies that are leading the way and working with their partners to innovate and to adapt and really to turn adversity into opportunity. So Vincennes, I hope that was okay. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time this morning, and now I'll hand back to the team so that we can get on with the truly exciting part of the webinar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Deirdre. That's a very nice complimentary overview. We have about 50 companies registering. Some will join us, I think, in the course of it. 43 are online right now. I have the pleasure of handing over to our 2 consultants. Suzanne Coles will introduce herself, and then from Technovia Solutions, she did the Swiss and UK market study, and Enca Martin-Rendon from Bale Consultancy will cover Belgium and France. After both, maybe you want to give a short intro of who you are and what these companies are about. Thank you. Oh, and sorry, and Jeanne Francoise Williamson, also of Bale Consultancy. She was also a critical contributor to it in the many interactions we had and in the research that was undertaken. Go ahead, please.
Jeanne, do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, sorry.
I'm Suzanne Coles. I covered the UK and the Swiss market. You can hear from my accent that I am British, but I've spent the majority of my career sitting over in Switzerland, specifically in Basel. I will be taking you through the landscape and market opportunities in the Swiss and the UK market, and have worked hand in glove with Jan and particularly Enca, interviewing many of the companies, drawing together trends, and then we have brought this presentation together. So I'll hand to Enca and Jan.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Enca Martin-Rendon. I'm a senior consultant for Bale Innovation. I will let Jan to introduce herself, but I'm delighted to be here today to share with you the findings of this project, and especially in the 2 markets, France and Belgium. Over to you, Jan.
Yes, hello. So I'm Jeanne-Françoise Williamson. I'm representing Emmanuel Grillo, the CEO of Bale today, who couldn't join us. I'll just give you a brief introduction about Bale Innovation. We're really a I'm the life science and innovation lead there. We are really a small European healthcare strategic advisory boutique, and we are specialized in life sciences, so from pharma, biotech, and medtech. And we really support clients throughout the whole cycle of any project, from strategic innovation to market launch, and that will include market entry, clinical innovation, strategic innovation. So we can really help our clients throughout the whole chain. We work with very large pharma companies such as Pharma, Mako Pharma in France. We work within the whole of the EU, and we have a really good vision of what is happening in the innovation space, both in the pharma, the biotech, and the life science area, which was quite a very nice thing to work with the Irish companies and try to see how the Irish landscape fits into this kind of booming and very quick changing landscape at the moment. So basically that's what we do. Hopefully you get a flavor of the type of work that we can produce, and if we can help any of the Irish company or enterprise Ireland in the future, we'd be delighted to support that really booming ecosystem in Ireland. And I will leave it to Enca to present the part about France and Belgium, which is the part we focused on for this project.
Thank you, Jeanne. Just to say that between the two consultancies, we have interviewed a number of companies. You can see those on the slide at the moment, and they range from large pharmaceutical companies, global companies, to a number of medium size as well, and companies. And it's just to give you a flavor of the interviews we have conducted. If I can have the next slide, please. Yes, and the next one. So let's talk about trends, opportunities, challenges in France and Belgium. Can I have the next one, please? Starting with France. So France is the fourth largest manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in Europe. It's considered a leader in the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products, and most of the products are finished products. And it's a large country, but it's also a large ecosystem. They do have 271 manufacturing facilities, and out of those, 32 of them are sites that are dedicated to bioproduction or production of biopharmaceuticals. The interesting thing about France is that it's very highly dependent on China and India. They do have a lot of manufacturing capacity in those two countries. And for example, 80% of these medicines, of the French medicines, are manufactured in China. Can I have the next one, please? And the other interesting thing about France is that the pharmaceutical ecosystem is built almost in clusters, in innovation clusters. France has been the birthplace of many pharmaceutical companies that these days are global companies, for example, Sanofi and the likes of Sanofi. And they have the tradition of working together in innovation clusters and consortia. And as you can see from the map, there are 6 large clusters dedicated to pharma. The largest ones of those are medicine near Paris, in the region called Ile-de-France, and the second one is Lyon Biopole. And all that started with one innovation cluster called Pole Pharma, which was funded in 2002 and is now the leading pharmaceutical cluster in Europe. There are other clusters in addition to these 6, more specific to be focusing on digital innovations and also digital technologies for healthcare. And the ecosystem in France is actually represented by a huge number of companies. You can see the number there, over 3,000 companies, and they cover all sort of size companies from, as I said, multinationals to small startups and medium-sized enterprises. Can I have the next one, please? The big challenges in France, especially in the last 18 months, has been actually COVID-19 or the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated a number of trends globally. A couple of them to mention, and not the only ones, but one is obviously disrupted supply chain, and the second one is the acceleration of the adoption of digital technologies by companies. And France in particular has been very negatively affected by COVID-19 because of their dependence on the Chinese and Indian market and the manufacturing that they have in those two countries. As a consequence of that, the French pharmaceutical industry is going through very profound changes. They are thinking of repatriating a lot of the manufacturing capacities back into France. And they're also thinking of investing in creating new manufacturing capacities. However, all these, and modernizing existing ones, however, all this will take quite some time. So these are long-term plans, and they require also a large amount of investment. So therefore, there is a collaboration, a clear collaboration, and a clear vision shared between the pharmaceutical companies and the government, or the political leaders and the regulators in France to make this happen in the next few years. The other thing that is happening, and we mentioned about the digital technologies being accelerated, or the adoption of digital technologies being accelerated by COVID-19. Well, this is well embedded in some of the big pharmaceutical companies in France. And some of the vision that is shared among some of them, or a group of them, is actually the training of the next generation of technologists that are going to be handling digital technologies and growing that field. And they do have some initiatives around that. The next one, please. Opportunities. Well, again, around the manufacturing capacity that France has. So they do have large companies investing, as I mentioned, in either expanding or modernizing their manufacturing facilities. There are several companies with several manufacturing sites in France, and the giant, for example, Sanofi, has got 18 manufacturing facilities in France. The opportunities that are open through these investment in manufacturing are around therapeutic antibodies, gene and cell therapies, novel vaccines. We've heard that already this morning, and products critical to manufacturing vaccines and other life-saving therapies. And to give you an example of some of those companies that are investing in increasing their manufacturing capacity in France, well, we're talking about Sanofi, Novartis, AstraZeneca, Evotec, Servier, so several of them. Can I have the next one, please? Now moving on to Belgium. It's an interesting market. Belgium is the European's second largest pharmaceutical production hub, and they do produce a lot of medicines as well in Belgium. So it's a major manufacturing and export center, but it has got also a very dynamic R&D sector. And what happens is that entrepreneurs have great opportunities to raise R&D capital in Belgium. The other thing that is important to know about Belgium is that clinical trials are or can be approved very, very quickly, in a matter of 15 to 20 days, compared to double that amount of time in France. So that means it makes Belgium a great place to actually deliver first-in-human clinical trials. In terms of the manufacturing facilities, well, there are about 32 production sites and 78 facilities are dedicated to biopharmaceuticals. Could I have the next one, please? The Belgian ecosystem is interesting as well because geographically Belgium is composed by two regions, Flanders and Wallonia, and the pharma ecosystem also is divided in two regions. For example, in Wallonia, the ecosystem, the pharmaceutical companies work very much like in France. It's very important to be part of these innovation clusters, and the only innovation cluster dedicated to health in Wallonia is called BioWin. And the other interesting thing in Belgium is that large pharmaceutical companies from outside Belgium have established their R&D facilities in Belgium to be able to collaborate with that emerging ecosystem and that very supportive ecosystem, supportive in terms of R&D. Could I have the next one, please? The challenges in Belgium. Obviously, Belgium hasn't been affected by COVID-19 in the way that France has been. Nevertheless, obviously, there's still what might have been quite impactful in the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic is probably now getting to the new normal. They do still have a relatively conservative mindset in terms of the adoption of digital technologies. They do have a very strong bias towards R&D, as I mentioned. And although they can approve clinical trials very rapidly, actually digital technologies haven't been embedded in the healthcare system as well as they have in France. So talking to the managing director of BioWin, she thought there's a lot more to do there, a lot more opportunities to have digital technologies in terms of monitoring patients and so on remotely, which is one of the things that has happened obviously through the pandemic. The next one, please. And as I mentioned, Belgium is also a place where there is a lot of manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals, and some of the large companies do have footprint in Belgium. We're talking of examples like GSK Biologicals, which is the side of GSK dedicated to vaccines, Pfizer, AstraZeneca again, Takeda, Corden Pharma, etc. And again, these large companies who have established the manufacturing facilities in Belgium have also opened opportunities for manufacturing, again, gene cell therapy products, therapeutic antibodies and vaccines, and those seem to be, both in France and Belgium, areas of development and opportunities at the moment. And I think that was the last one of my session. I'll pass it over to Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Enca. Okay, next slide, please. So we've mirrored the format so that we can go through in the same way. So onto the land of Toblerone. And I think the first thing to say is what Switzerland is famous for. And I think you all know that's chocolate, it's watches, but very much increasingly it is pharmaceuticals. 20 years ago, pharmaceuticals accounted for just 25% of gross exports. It now accounts for nearly 50%. And that shows just how important the life sciences market has become. Switzerland is a world leader in innovation. I think, as Enca and I compared slides, almost every company using some form of index puts themselves in the top 3. But for the last 10 years, Switzerland has become consistently the world leader, not just in life sciences, but in almost every parameter that can be measured. Switzerland is small. I used to live, well, I did live until COVID-19 in Basel, and the distance between those two top dots is just 50 minutes on a high-speed train, and that corridor between Zurich and Basel is a very, very important one, with the amount of traffic between global headquarters in the Zurich area and Basel. It's the second largest exporter of packaged medicines, with about 11% of the global total, so a little bit like Ireland. It's a very small country with a very, very big footprint, and it's really a very, very important industry. It's a very high growth market. I'm going to come on to some of the challenges and some of the opportunities, but effectively COVID and everything that has happened around COVID has had very, very little impact on Switzerland. It's a high growth market. It has about 900 companies and employs 135,000 people. It's home, as I think almost everybody will know, to two of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Roche and Novartis. And like the presentation that Enca and Bale gave, it is regionally clustered, but those clusters are really quite different in the way that clusters operate in the Belgian and the French market. You can see we have the Basel cluster. I would describe that as R&D heavy, with a very strong emphasis on the biologics, cell and gene therapy area. There is some manufacturing, but not very much. It is, of course, home to the Novartis campus and the Roche campus in Kleinsacherstrasse. Zurich and Zug, the area which forms another triangle along sitting up at the top with Lucerne, this is home to many of the European headquarters, and this is something I'm going to come back to in opportunities, that because of the Swiss, I would say not leniency, that's possibly too easy in a word, but because of the positive market environment in Switzerland, many international companies have chosen to make their international headquarters, as in their non-domestic headquarters, or their European headquarters in that triangle. And then we move down to Bern, to Lausanne and Genève, and this is very much the mid-tier national companies, and much of the manufacturing activity takes down there. It's not very much going on the right hand side of the map, so I will move on. The only thing again to stress that there is a demographic here of where activity takes place. There's a lot of medical device activity taking place in Lucerne, Zug and Zurich. Basel is very much an R&D centre, and then moving downwards you have the mid-tier companies and manufacturing. But they are not the same as the innovation clusters that Enca has just described in Belgium and in France. So because we have heard many very similar things, I'm going to do a little bit of a compare and contrast as I go through these major European markets. And Enca, please chime in if you want to. Next slide, please. So the challenges. What I put in this diagram here is we are looking at the impact of COVID, as Enca stressed, and I think Deirdre said as well, 63%. This was a very large survey done in December of last year amongst pharmaceutical executives of nearly 200 companies. And it's more a qualitative response, but 63% of clinical trials were disrupted. The supply chain was disrupted. I talked to, I think, about 22 people in Switzerland across some really top tier companies, across manufacturing, across all functions, some biotech companies, and some very different types of companies sitting in some of the innovation accelerators. And they reported almost no impact of COVID on their day-to-day business. There was perhaps a 2-week hiccup, but they had anticipated this. They had robust supply chains. They missed about 2 weeks of inventory, even though 40% of clinical trials are run through, or at least touch, China, and about 70% of generics companies, generics products come through India and China. There was relatively little impact. In fact, I couldn't get anybody to say that they had been detrimentally affected. They saw it as an opportunity. So again, slightly different to the French market. Challenges. This is a small market, but a very, very sophisticated market. And there is a very, very strong top tier that you will all be familiar with, the Roche and the Novartis. One of the reasons that these companies were so little disrupted by COVID is that they have first mover advantage. They started their manufacturing innovation in 2012, 2013. They created chains of biologic and ATMP manufacturing facilities in advance. Much of the digital work that is being done has been laid down years in advance. There are some very mature strategies in these very big companies. In fact, COVID has, when I say not been a challenge, if anything, it has created a surplus of money. There has been so little traveling, so little attendance of conferences, that there has been budget left over, and this has been outside the really major programs of launching global innovation hubs in manufacturing and process technology excellence. There has been a lot of spare money for smaller pilot initiatives, and opportunistically, that's something I'm going to come back to. There are therefore very high expectations of what a new vendor will bring, and reflecting what Deirdre said at the beginning of this webinar, Ireland has a great deal of innovation. It has excellent solutions to bring to these companies. The final part of this presentation will be how we can leverage some of these trends to find a way into these companies, because they are somewhat impenetrable. There are routes in, but there's a very high degree of expectation on the value proposition, and there is many of these strategies are mature. If I had to differentiate between Roche and Novartis, Roche, my alma mater, somewhat more, when I say conservative, it forms very strong Swiss collaborative partnerships with its vendors that it treats like family, and it will stay in for 5 years. Novartis has much more of an American flavor and will turn over new vendors, providing opportunities every 6 months to a year. There are a lot more niche, when I say niche, not niche, there are a lot of mid-tier companies that may provide more opportunity, easier low-hanging fruit. They are conservative. If you were to move between a similar role in Novartis and Roche and down to Vifor, you would see a very significant difference, not in quality, but in the level of sophistication and the maturity. And unlike, I think, France and Belgium, there is very, very little language challenge. Maybe in some of the smaller manufacturing facilities, in some of the more country-based manufacturing sites, there may be challenges, but I know that my personal assistant spoke 4 languages, and that's, in fact, every taxi driver does pretty much the same, and it does put me to shame sometimes when I'm operating within the country, the flexibility of the language. So I think the thing, if I had to conclude on Switzerland, before I move on to opportunities, it's a sophisticated market, it's a very wealthy market, it has some very, very large and well-known players with very sophisticated strategies, but these strategies have been in place for a time, and there are high levels of incumbent competition. So let's come on to the opportunities. Next slide, please. I've picked R&D as a graph. It shows Switzerland well out front in terms of the number of pharmaceutical patents that it holds per capita. Again, it's a small country that packs a very, very heavy punch. I think that the thing about Switzerland is, having lived in Basel on and off for 7 years, is particularly walking through parts of Basel, you're as likely to bump into an American as a Brit as you are somebody Swiss. In fact, sometimes walking around either campus, it's quite hard to find somebody who's genuinely Swiss. These are massive international companies, and I think the reason that is important is, if you take a position within a Novartis or a Roche, it's a merry-go-round in Switzerland. Half the people that I spoke to were in different roles a year ago, chasing bigger roles, more interest. People move, entire teams move, drugs fail, drugs lift off, more exciting work is being done elsewhere. And it's very much a roundabout. So even if you were to start small, in somewhere like Vifor or an Ipsen or any of the other regional companies, Janssen Cilag, you could very well find yourself with a client or a sponsor within one of the big companies within a couple of years. everybody knows everybody in this country, it seems. I would say it's one of the most innovative markets I've worked in, and I suppose my career divides up really between the States and Switzerland, with a little bit more of my early work in the UK with GSK and AstraZeneca. It's a world leader in digital. I think many of you who are involved in this space, and it crosses all of the major global functions, will be aware that Novartis has launched its Novartis AI Innovation Fund unit. And in fact, in 2021, they were complaining, having hired 80 people this year with AI expertise, that they were having to go further and further out to look for more and more people. It's a massive innovation hub. It's also moved into biologics, cell and gene therapy, probably over the last decade, going back 10 years. And that's not just a move into rare diseases, orphan diseases, cell and gene therapy in the discovery and the research space, but also in manufacturing. So clinical trials, it's a very, very welcoming environment. And as I said, as a very, very wealthy market, networks of public and private investment into the market are very, very high, and there are a large number of centres of excellence, again, clustered around these markets. So next slide, please. The UK. Again, it looks like a clustering. In fact, these are, once again, nothing like the French and the Belgian clusters. This is roughly where activity sits out. Again, the UK, despite having Brexit as a challenge lurking on the market, is an enormous and high growth market with a turnover of over 74 billion. Has 5,000, it's nearly 6,000 companies and 2,500 jobs, and those are just the direct jobs. You can probably double or triple that if you consider the the indirect jobs that are associated with that. Like France with Sanofi, like Switzerland with Roche and Novartis, the UK is also home to GSK and AstraZeneca, and with that you have some of the challenges as well as opportunities that we've been talking about. These are top tier companies with mature strategies and have umbrella strategies that have been in place for a while. With their size, that does make them more opportunistic, and there is money there. I think there are centres of excellence in gene therapy and large-scale clinical trials. The big difference, I think, between the UK and the other 4 markets is the NHS. The NHS is a massive national healthcare system that acts as a major aggregator for innovation and driving activity in clinical trials. And actually, clinical trial activity went up by 8% in 2020, and I will come on to that in a little bit while. There are huge amounts of investment from the DTI and the UK Innovation Fund, who have pumped in, who foresee 80 billion increased value in the UK. And I've just been given a 3-minute warning. I will speed up a little bit. No language barriers. Moving on. Can we move on, Glenn? One slide. The challenges. The market is focused on biologics. It's been relatively unaffected by COVID and Brexit, but likewise, AstraZeneca and GSK, being world leaders, have mature strategies, and they are relatively difficult to penetrate. At the end of this presentation, we will talk about procurement. GSK has some of the toughest procurement rules anywhere that I've ever worked. Many partnerships, many different relationships with existing big name suppliers. Why hire a small company when you can hire Microsoft or IBM, but also pockets of high growth activity and innovation. Many international companies have regional affiliates there. And if you look at the ATMP, R&D and manufacturing, these balance out Brexit. So moving on to opportunities, which I think is what we all want to talk about. The UK has strong national companies and global representation. It's a gateway to the rest of the world. I think the biggest thing to happen in 2021 is the Cambridge Biomedical Campus. That's been around for a while, but AstraZeneca opens its major international headquarters there, and with it comes about 200 other companies, startups, major centres of excellence. We have the NHS, we have world-class process development. So if I had to pick out a major opportunity for the UK, it'd be in manufacturing. That's standard manufacturing, very much sitting in the north of England, and then moving up to biologics manufacturing in Scotland. That's the Medicines Manufacturing Initiative. It has a large network of global backed innovation hubs and centres of excellence. These are very, very important partners. No language barrier. Final thing to say about this is not only do we have national companies here, we have the UK and Ireland affiliates. It's usually a joint business, and therefore you could leverage connections within the Irish market to move on. So that, and very briefly, is the UK and Switzerland, and I think I hand back to Enca for the next part.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, the second part of this webinar, where we're going to try to explain to you how you could leverage projects and initiatives to hopefully expand your client base in those markets. And we could start with France and Belgium. The next one, please. To start with France and Belgium, I'm going to go back to the global market trends, because I mentioned the disrupted supply chain, and I mentioned the digital technology adoption because of COVID, but those are just part of global market trends that were there before COVID-19, and the pandemic has just accelerated some of them. So starting with a new model of drug development, and that has been around for some time, trying to speed up drug development, because obviously only 1 out of 10 pharmaceutical products get to clinical trials. The second trend is the design thinking in clinical protocols. Clinical protocols that, especially for cancer, they have been a lot more flexible in terms of the number of patients recruited, the type of patients recruited, the type of applications. They call some of them basket trials. The third trend is the need to implement flexible manufacturing processes and supply chain. And the fourth one, the investment in enterprise technology. Another one is the search on digital technologies, as I mentioned, and data management and analytics that's been there for some time. And it includes, but is not limited to, operations 4.0, call also industry 4.0, pharma 4.0, predictive analytics, and the development of software for medical devices, but not only for medical devices, also for monitoring clinical trials, for monitoring patients remotely, and tracking the information that will help the discussion on health economics and reimbursement for some of these drugs. And the final market trend that I wanted to mention is the leverage of partnership as a competitive advantage between companies. Next one, please. An enabler of how these global trends are creating value in the pharmaceutical value chain is digital technologies or digital innovation. And there are a lot of companies investing already in digital innovations. But this is an example to show you that runs across all the phases of drug development, from R&D through process development, manufacturing, and all the way to clinical trials. And with different influencing different parts of it in different ways. R&D, for example, was a process that would used to take 4 years to complete. However, we've seen with the new vaccines, you can do that in 18 months. So if we can do that for the vaccines, we probably could do it for many of the other medicines. And in terms of, for example, process development, the interesting thing about digital innovations and digital technology is that we are faster at being able to sieve through processes and workflows to ideally pick up the best one and the best one for scalability and manufacturing. And so those are just examples. Some of the large pharmaceutical companies started to plan their digital transformation many years ago, but as I said, this is just something that it has been accelerated by COVID-19 too. Let's move on to the next one, please. Okay, and I need to talk about procurement because we've discussed this at large with Enterprise Ireland and with Suzanne. And as a new client, the procurement department may not be the ideal entry to gain a new client, but you need to know what the procedures are. And although the procurement procedures might be different in different companies, we have chosen this one as a best practice because it's something that gives you the flavor of what's coming or what is to come. The example is the procurement process in UCB, the Belgian large company. And like many of the other companies, they do expect their suppliers to comply with their code of conduct. And normally those code of conduct, especially for the large companies, they're accessible from their website. They're also becoming very aware that the corporate responsibility has to be also shared in procurement and in purchasing. And that corporate responsibility is driving the decisions in terms of purchasing and procurement. They are raising the social and environmental standards, and they have made a commitment, especially in UCB, but this is something that is coming. They have made a commitment to sustainability. And because of that, they have developed now a process in conjunction with another company, which is called EcoVadis. So you can see there the procedure as a new or existing customer of UCB. You're now going to be asked to register online with their system, and you're going to be asked to give evidence of your sustainability plans and your sustainability commitment. And they, at UCB, they're going to be ranking those suppliers according to, obviously, numbers. And they will then give you, as an existing supplier or a new supplier, the result of that ranking. They're also, if obviously they have a cutoff, and if you pass that cutoff, you will be accepted as a supplier. And they obviously are very happy to discuss with you how to become better at sustainability and put plans in place. But I do know that Enterprise Ireland has also the capability of supporting you as in this journey, and to, as I said, to improve your sustainability plans, because it's something that, although as I said, it's obvious from large companies like UCB, is something that will probably be the normal practice or the best practice for many companies. Next one, please. So going back to then France and Belgium, and this is just a summary for you to take away. It's what are the barriers to market penetration in these two countries. So we have seen that these two countries are relatively insular in terms of the pharmaceutical ecosystem. They work very much in clusters. New clients are gained most likely through word of mouth and trust, and the language is a real barrier. So being able to translate your documentation, or being able to have someone into French, or having someone on the ground to be able to do those introductions for you is key. And being connected to these innovation clusters and consortium, that is very, very important, much more important than it's been in the UK and Switzerland, like Suzanne mentioned. So that's very important. The innovation clusters is very important, the importance of language as well. And although I have spoken about procurement and the procurement department, the most important thing to consider is the likelihood of getting a new client through the procurement department is probably low. you need to address the needs of the end user. And but the end user, we mean, well, the head of function, the head of production in a manufacturing plant and so on, and not necessarily the procurement department, although the procurement department will work with the internal stakeholders very closely to help that process. In terms of doing projects for the large pharmaceutical companies who already have plans for the next 5 to 10 years, that, although it may happen, it may be just opportunistic, and there might be a better way to get new clients and become known in those markets by working with medium-sized companies and have them as longer-term customers or partners. The next one, please. So how could the Irish companies benefit to try to gain and win businesses in France and Belgium? So consider now the peculiarities of those two markets and think that maybe you need to do have a targeted landscape and competitor analysis, know what's actually happening in those countries, who are your possible or potential competitors, and prepare a marketing campaign again that is fit for those countries. And by that I mean consider the change in the translation into the French language. Review your commercial plan for those markets, have a deeper understanding of the market intelligence, and review your operational plans and probably your business strategies, because it might be a need to reposition your product within those markets, and it might be different to what you're doing already for other markets. In the next one, please. Well, that was it for me until later, and I will pass it over to Suzanne.
And I'll ask Enca to stay on with me because we've found many similarities, and I'm going to try and highlight the differences against France and Belgium where I can. We've talked about this a lot. We've found many similar things. I think I will use the term globalization. There are global trends, but they localize in different ways. So the major industry drivers we've already talked about. We've talked about COVID-19. I think maybe for Enca in France and Belgium, that's had more of an impact than it has in the UK and in Switzerland, where it's considered a major opportunity and an accelerator of existing initiatives, exactly as Enca was mentioning. Then there's a huge trend around patient centricity, and I'm going to come on to a slide that I won't discuss in much more detail, otherwise I'll get another 3-minute warning. But patient centricity, I'm trying to use these drivers across the entire value chain. It could be genomics research and actually mapping against a phenotype of a patient, the rise of rare diseases, talking to people, and actually working in a rare diseases department myself, where almost every drug, when taken down to a phenotypic level and pathophysiology, could be a rare disease specific to an individual, to myself or to Enca, or to people of our demographic category or genetic makeup. And then data management, which is something that Enca has already talked about, but in some cases having it expressed almost as, well, the solution is great, but the data that the solution generates within the ecosystem is as important as the solution itself. You'll see on the right-hand side, I've put technology enablers. This is very similar to what Enca took you through with the impact of digital technology, but the major advances that are being made in technology innovation are underpinning these. It doesn't mean you have to have a digital solution, but just be aware that technology innovation is a massive driver of the trends. And I will summarize some of these trends. The rising complexity and cost of development in 2020, for the very first time, R&D as a percentage of revenues went over 20% and hit 125 billion, a world record. As Enca said, I think when I started in the industry, 3 out of 10 drugs made it onto the market. It's even less than that now. And this is driving much M&A activity where people now choose to buy their pipelines. Roche buys Genentech and repositions itself as a cell and gene therapy specialist in oncology rather than home growing solutions. There's increasing regulation, but also actually changes in regulation. To get a vaccine, as Enca mentioned, out onto the market in a year actually takes flexibility, and possibly one of the most regulated and conservative industries, I think, on the planet. There are a few industries that are as regulated as the pharmaceutical market, given the end product ends up in the human body. The increasing need for flexible manufacturing, precision medicine, if you want a batch, almost not quite at a kilo lab level, but you are going to need adaptive and flexible manufacturing to be able to scale up, scale down, look at clinical trials, pull forwards, trials that used to take 8 or 9 years, now taking 3 or 4 years. In fact, I talked to one of my old colleagues who was very much in the biometrics and digital biomarkers market, and saying, well, if you can map an assay and find the right target, he sort of described it as a pressure cooker. You can just throw the biological ingredients in, and then you've got a product in the afternoon. Just give it a good swish around. Not sure it's quite as simple as that, but the point he was making is if you can understand it and map it at this level, you can produce medicines down to an almost individual level. And at the same time, coming from my old department in rare diseases, the average cost of a drug, 200, 500, 700,000. I'm sure you will have all heard in the last 2 weeks that the Novartis SMA drug was used for the very first time in the UK on the NHS, and that's 1.7 million a shot. At the same time, all markets are running out of money with the rising cost of healthcare and the aging population and COVID, and need to actually depress those costs. And finding, I think, a massive trend is alternative deliveries for mechanisms for healthcare delivery and consuming healthcare in very different ways. So next slide, please, Glenn. I'm not going to go through this, but I've mapped these trends, and I think Enca has mentioned many of them, but I've tried to line these up against a standard value chain that I think you all work across: drug development and clinical trials, manufacturing and commercial. This is everything from the rise of precision medicine, big data for genomics and preventative measures, clinical trial automation, Pharma 4.0 that Enca has already mentioned, and then patient compliance and very high expectations of beyond the pill solutions. So I'll definitely get a warning if I stay on this one, so I think we'll move on to the next one. So I have a slightly different perspective on procurement. I think, merged the majority of the factors that you would see in procurement in a major industry. This is not specific to one company like UCB, but it picks up the components of policies that I've seen in both the UK and Switzerland, and in fact been subject to myself. Quality standards and a supplier code of conduct, you can almost always download those from the website. Risk management assessments, that's becoming increasingly common. You will be put through everything from a Dun & Bradstreet as a new supplier, your website, all the basic details that would be held in the UK equivalent of the company's house, but increasingly sustainability and on-site audits, not quite as specific as the UCB example that Enca gave, but you will be expected not just to tick a box complying to these standards, but actually be regularly audited on it. The other thing that I've seen is a massive increase in cybersecurity and actually risk management policies, and having the IT department crawl all over your cybersecurity policy. I'll give an example of Merck, the Gardasil drug, which is a human PAP drug. I think it was in 2017, the majority of Gardasil was shut down through cyber hacking. It shut down 34 of their plants and their servers, and Gardasil missed its targets for supply and distribution against global contracts for the year. Master Services Agreement, and I think this is close to what Enca has been talking about, is procurement is not a route into these companies, but failing to comply with procurement can cause major challenges. And GSK probably has the most punitive system that I'm aware of, and you cannot begin a project or even apply for an RFP without a Master Services Agreement in place. The reason I mention this is GSK looks like a huge opportunity. It can take up to 18 months to get a Master Services Agreement in place. So the way that, before I come on to my final conclusions, the way that I look at companies is, what is their innovation profile? How open are they to new vendors? Are they doing innovative things? Are they conservative? Are you looking at a Vifor, for example, that has been more conservative in its uptake of manufacturing automation, or you're looking at a Novartis that has probably the world-leading AI innovation hub? What is the opportunity? Are they launching new drugs? This is something that was picked up again and again. The best part of the life cycle to target is a drug that is either in phase 3B, perhaps sometimes even earlier, or just launching because that's where all the budgets are and where the money is being spent. By late life cycle, they're being put almost to bed and there is less money for innovation. And then compare this against procurement. Is it centralized? Can we go through affiliates? Is all decision making made by a global team sitting in the US? So this is how I think about procurement. It's complex, it's almost always centralized these days, and it's multi-stakeholder. You cannot just sell into commercial and ignore the medical team. It's a multi-dimensional sell. So next slide, please. So key takeaways: a value proposition must be tailored to meet the needs of the business end user, and this is absolutely critical. You may think that you have a compelling value proposition. Are the USPs targeted to end user requirements? Again and again and again, people told me that they see glossy presentations, they pull out USPs, but they're not differentiated and they don't meet the needs. So what feels like highly differentiated to you feels generic to them. So really tighten the value proposition. Reference case studies are key. The more that you can leverage Ireland and the work you've done, if you're working in Pfizer in Ireland, it's much easier to knock on the door of Pfizer in Switzerland or the UK. So as I said, leverage all connections. There is no direct entry through the procurement department. In fact, one of the people said is, don't go too high, don't go to CXOs. They are not your business end users. You will not know. They will not know what's really going on, but a director has a signing authority of about 250,000. And if you can get in under that budget, you probably won't trigger procurement, and you can find a way of developing innovative pilot projects that create your reference test case within the company. Projects for top tier companies, just like Enca in Switzerland, in Belgium and France, are probably opportunistic, and the medium-sized companies are probably lower hanging fruit, with the understanding that it is a merry-go-round, particularly in Switzerland with people moving companies. But increasingly, because I would say Switzerland and the UK are the opposite of France and Belgium, they are not insular, they are wholly international, that somebody in AstraZeneca is very likely to end up in Novartis, who may then go back to Sanofi before moving on to Novartis. So Switzerland, cell and gene therapy research, ATMP clinical trials, biologics manufacturing, and they are the first movers globally in digital technology. The UK, cell and gene therapy research, process engineering. There are many centres of excellence and government initiatives taking place across the UK to build particularly the northern counties, the northern powerhouse, as it's been termed, into an international manufacturing excellence centre. Regional manufacturing hubs, many of the big companies have manufacturing hubs across the UK, and biologics manufacturing. So I think that's my final slide. Perhaps I have one more. So robust market segmentation. These are smallish markets, but extremely complex. Look at the capability, capacity, and level of centralization. I think you need a very targeted approach to top tier companies. Scattergunning across them is unlikely to be successful. Immersion with the local incubators. Base Launch in Basel will incubate a company and take it through the first 90 days. And what's important in both the UK and in Switzerland is that the majority of those companies, those incubators and centres of excellence, also have industry partners. So you are likely to find Novartis being one of the founding partners of those centres of excellence or incubation hubs. Go for the venture teams. I've sat in a venture team myself. We are aggregators of business needs. We know what commercial wants. We know what a newly launched drug needs before it launches. Probably don't know that much about manufacturing, but we will know the disease area strategy for the research departments. And then choose the right time. Go for the late stage development or the early product life cycle where the money is. And understand that if you're targeting commercial, you will need to meet the needs of IT. If you're going into process engineering and you're going into manufacturing or supply chain, you will need to meet with IT. So have a value proposition that creates a benefits case for all the people within those networks. And that's Switzerland and the UK. So I think, Enca, we have a roadmap that we've put together that sums both of what we've found. So I was going to take the first page, wasn't I?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to mention something. So
Absolutely.
it would have been very difficult, very challenging for us to put a stepwise process for each of the companies that are part of Enterprise Island or clients in Enterprise Islands, because as you can imagine, you're part of a large cluster, very diverse number of companies at very different stages. So what we have tried to do here is just to give general ideas of how to proceed, what's the best roadmap to get into any of these markets. So of course it's a little bit more general, but I'm happy to say that Suzanne will start with the steps to win businesses in these 4 countries. Over to you, Suzanne.
We'll do this quickly so that we can leave as many questions as much time. Establish your market positioning. As Enca said, update the website, but not just with your market offering, but with use cases and clinical evidence. That's absolutely key. In Switzerland and the UK, they want clinical evidence. You have to keep the clinical team happy. Build differentiated value propositions with clear USPs. Don't just think about what you want to sell, but what it is that somebody wants to buy. Connect with the regional clusters and centres of excellence. In Enca's market, this is the innovation clusters, but you need to increase the visibility, whether it's innovation clusters in my markets, in the national industry associations. Partner with the government innovation incubators like Base Launch in Switzerland. Glocalize. One size does not fit all. What happens in France, while subject to macro trends, is not what is happening in the UK and Switzerland, or at least not the national flavour of that. Develop market intelligence on specific capabilities on national competition, and review the regulatory and reimbursement landscape. It may be standard across Europe, but there may be some regional quirks. Identify your stakeholders. I can't say again and again, procurement is not the right way in, but finding the right business owner, and not at CXO level, but probably a couple of levels down, somewhere between associate director, director, and maybe even senior director. But executives and CXOs, unless it's a much smaller company, just too senior to be connected to the business, and not often the budget holders. And then adjust your value proposition. So Enca, I'll pass to you for the final page.
Thank you, Suzanne. The next one, please. And following on what Suzanne has mentioned, it's important to connect with the business owner. So leverage what Enterprise Island and Irish affiliate connections and clusters and government incubators. That's quite important. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but in France and Belgium, that's very important. That's critical, actually. And so target those incubators, those clusters, innovation clusters, and to become part of it, part of their teams. And that way you will probably, well, apart from gaining exposure and familiarity amongst those clusters, you will also be accessing medium and large size companies. That's all about increasing visibility, which is what Suzanne has mentioned before. Access to digital strategy. If it is important to accelerate the implementation of some of these key digital innovations, because it's something that is an opportunity that has been opened by the pandemic, and facilitate partnerships with those companies that are deploying digital initiatives as well, and ensure that your product solutions or services can all be integrated into existing systems. Obviously, what your potential clients want is that they have already something in-house. They want to know that that's going to still be valid when they buy some of your services or solutions. And finally, fulfill the procurement requirements. Again, it's something that every existing and a new supplier will have to go through with large companies, especially support sustainability performance and set up improvement plans. That is very important, and of course fulfill global procurement processes to enable master service agreement. That's something that Suzanne mentioned is quite important to bear that in mind. And I think that is all from us. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I will pass it over to Vincent to close the session. Or no, sorry, the Q&A session first. Over to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Enca and Suzanne, Jean-François. Yes, we are open now for questions from the audience. Is there anybody who would like to come forth first? Otherwise, Rebecca, who's been taking note, will sort of read out some of the questions that might be of interest. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I will kick off. Thank you very much, Vincent. So we've had a few really interesting questions come in already, actually, and I would encourage people to keep sending them in, and we'll field as many of them as we can. So the first question that came in was relating to digital transformation. So we know that digital transformation is a hot topic across the 4 markets, but are you aware of any grant assistance that multinationals can tap into on the digital agenda that a digital supplier can leverage?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Rebecca? The question was about tapping into?
Yes, so the question was about, are you aware of any grant assistance that multinationals can tap into on the digital agenda that a digital supplier can leverage? And I think that's relevant across the 4 markets.
As far as France and Belgium are concerned, it's very, there might be some grants, but they will all be national. They will all be national. So an Irish supplier would not be able to leverage, this would not be leverageable from an external partner.
I think grants may have to come from the European Commission and be part of a program and most likely a consortia between different companies in different European countries.
So I would agree with Enca, as we voted ourselves out of the European Union. I'm not going to comment on that with Brexit. There is a lot of activity and there is a lot of financing within the UK, lots of startups, lots of different digital innovation hubs. I don't know specifically who is eligible, but these are almost always consortia, as Enca has just mentioned, of academic institutes, of major industry players and other. I don't know if the grants, the funding is available only for UK companies or whether that is broader.
Rebecca, Glenn here, maybe just to answer to that, we've had a number of queries and fully agree with what Jean, Enca and Suzanne said. If you want to engage within the European Union, and unfortunately UK isn't part of that, there is increasing numbers, pots of money, and we're doing an awful lot. And what I would suggest, if the company is a specific area of interest, is to get in touch with our Horizon 2020 team and the national contact points. It's probably Sergio, but again, we can talk to the company about that in terms of them participating. There's a number of calls coming on this agenda, and we've got a whole team of people helping companies to connect with European partners around this. The other piece I would say is that if those Irish suppliers are working with pharma manufacturers here in Ireland, of course they can participate in our innovation partnership program, which you can collaborate with a multinational company here in Ireland. And we've got a really significant pot of money to help large and small companies work with third level institutions, or alternatively our huge fund, the Disruptive Technology Fund. Again, there's a lot of digital transformation programs involving large multinationals, but as Enca and Jean and Suzanne, they would have to have a base in Ireland to be working with that Irish supplier in order to avail of the DETA funding here in Ireland, or the Innovation Partnership funding here in Ireland.
A slight extension as well. Watch out for regulation. It's not exactly off topic, and I know that Germany is not a key market, but for example, a digital therapeutic coming into a German market at the moment will have to conform with the DIGA Act and register itself. So just be aware of that as well. Keep an eye on regulation.
But the DIGA is actually very quick. It's a very fast tracking regulatory track for any digital
just to be aware of local regulation.
There's quite a lot. Just one additional point from the EU, if you're going on the EU 20, all the EU grants, I'm actually an expert evaluator for the European Commission. And what is interesting, and I'll just flag it up, they've completely changed the assessment process, and they are very keen on innovation. And really, they're evaluating ideas. So I would encourage all the Irish teams, especially the one in innovation, to submit applications. It can now be done as a single person, single applicant as well. These calls are ongoing to evaluate ideas. The evaluation process has been streamlined. It's much faster. The first steps are faster. They are, do we like the idea? Yes, we want to know more. So I would encourage everybody to apply if there's anything that you can see on there. It's a bit off topic, but since we talked about the grants, I thought I'll mention it.
I suppose in terms of the UK, although now we're not part of the EU, but a similar type of grant for industry are those coming from Innovate UK as well.
Which is when we talked about consortia partners, Innovate UK, in its very many different forms. The digital incubator that I talked about is an Innovate UK subgroup, is quite often part of the consortia.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a good few questions coming in here, I see, which is great. So I'm going to move on to the next question. So the next question that has come in is, do you think that UK R&D will move from the UK to mainland Europe, so Switzerland, Belgium, France, because of Brexit and the move of the EMA to Amsterdam?
Everything that I heard, no. Which was a surprise. 2 to 3 years ago, when there was a huge amount of uncertainty, I was at big conferences where I stood next to the British Biotech Association, who were trying to convince people to come and invest in the UK, and they looked so miserable. They really looked unhappy. But then I actually look at the amount of money that's being poured into certain areas like the UK, like Cambridge, the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, and I would say, if it's in cell and gene therapy in particular, but also large-scale sort of traditional small molecules, nothing that I heard told me that people were outsourcing.
The large pharmaceutical.
That's not the definitive answer, but nobody was about to move everything. I think while there was a confusion period, there was a great deal more of a question mark over what it all meant.
I agree with what Suzanne. No, I agree with what Suzanne has mentioned. So large pharmaceutical companies had established R&D facilities somewhere else in Europe before. I don't think that's something new. And whoever wanted to move out of the UK probably has moved out of the UK. The R&D ecosystem in the UK is booming. Especially with artificial intelligence, and is also booming with manufacturing and everything that goes through R&D in manufacturing, which is quite important. And in terms of gene and cell therapy, we are the largest hub of gene and cell therapy development, R&D, and outside the US. So no is the answer.
Yeah, and I would agree. You know, we know that nobody's moving. It's too expensive, too much effort involved. Moving just because of Brexit is not gonna bring anything. Activities continue, trading will continue in the life science sector in one way or the other.
Okay, that's great.
And if anything, we've seen the opposite, which is money pouring in.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. So The next question is, how important is it to have your software or literature in multi-languages? This is an interesting question, I think, because the barrier of languages was touched upon for the markets. So I don't know who'd like to begin.
Well, in my experience, it's very important in France and Belgium, and it's even more important when you go to try to talk to some of the head of department, for example, head of production or the head of manufacturing plant, because although everyone is able to speak English, but obviously the level of English might not be, what they're most comfortable with speaking in English, and so it is very important.
So I think it's just, especially for France and Belgium, you have to find a balance. You have to also find something that makes sense for the size of your company. If you're a relatively small company, I think you just have to decide what will need to be translated, and maybe it is the software rather than the literature. Maybe it's better to have a French-speaking person. So it's finding that right balance, depending on the size of the company, I would say. But it's clear, and if you want to know your clients, if you want to know what's going on within a company, this will be done in French when chit-chatting. So you just have to find a way to hear those chit-chats, because that's how you're going to get the clients and secure your entry, not by having tons of documentation. So it's really finding that balance of what will be critical to be translated. And of course, I would focus probably into French. I wouldn't focus into, the other part of Belgium. I would stick to the French first, because this is also more realistic for companies. You have to be pragmatic with it.
Thank you. Suzanne, do you have anything to add?
UK, it's I would say it's obvious. I can only think that in some of the smaller mid-tier companies in regional manufacturing sites, you might need German. But I can't see that it's a deal breaker in the same way that it is for Belgium and for France, where it will be done in French. I have sat in French teams that are multi-nationality, and we've all ended up defaulting into French, even when we have German speakers who can't speak French.
That's great, thank you. Moving on to the next question. So the next one that has come in is, how important is it to set up a company in the country doing business? And if one is not set up, could there be issues?
Well, I guess it depends. It depends on your size, and it depends on the. You don't need in France. You don't need to have a company based in France, or unless you want to trade with the government, which would be easier. But you don't have to have a French-based company. You just need to have a French-speaking person there, or you have a French-speaking person in your team. I don't think it's critical. Of course, there might be a couple of cases where this statement does not apply, so it's on a case-to-case basis. But on a generally, I would say no, it's not that critical.
I would agree with
I agree.
Jan, that particularly setting up a company in Switzerland is ludicrously expensive. Most people go and sit in Zug because it has, should we say, tax benefits, but it will not prohibit you from doing business in Switzerland. Unless, which is to Jan's point of exceptional circumstances, if you are going into something closer to a government level organization when priority is given to local companies. It's not like Japan, for example, where you have to have a registered presence and you have to partner with a Japanese company and you have to be 49% and the Japanese partner has to be 51%. It's not that stringent.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. A couple more questions that have just come in. So This is an interesting one. Is there a difference in market entry strategy between mature products and newer technologies? And does this differ between the countries?
I'll talk from the perspective of venture teams, that I think if you are a smaller company with less infrastructure and maybe, I don't want to say a more innovative product, because everybody I talked to in Enterprise Ireland certainly had a very robust product and solution which would be of interest to clients. But if you don't want to be caught up in the infrastructure of a massive company, going in through one of the venture teams who act effectively across hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, the size of Roche and Novartis globally are 100,000 people each, but the venture hubs like Novartis Biome or the Roche Venture Incubation Team, they will be able to route you through and go, right, I know that this product, this SMA product is launching, they need a digital this, or they need that, or they need automation of this, and they will find the right place. They may even have been tasked with finding the right company and throwing out a venture radar to look at it through that. I think mature products, it's much more about knowing the business owner and finding your pathway through to a business owner at the right level, rather than targeting the global head of process engineering. That would be my first answer, I think. Maybe Enca, you've got a different perspective.
Well, I think it's going to be also on a case by case based. I think it depends. In France, some of the large companies, I'm sure they do have their department where they are evaluating innovations and looking at partnerships or licensing from smaller companies with more disruptive technology. So I think it's going to depend on what offering you bring to them. Jeanne, you might have something else to comment on.
I just piggyback on what Enca's just said, that actually that's really important, and Enca picked it up in her slides as well. There are different business models now, and it's no longer just a vendor agreement or a licensing agreement, particularly with a smaller company that doesn't have the infrastructure. They may consider very different types of business models and co-development through that way. So that's just something that was mentioned in Enca's presentation that I just wanted to say there. I'm sorry, Jeanne.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes with innovation, it's a little bit easier to get in because you are usually unique. It's easier to identify the exact person. You have to go to the innovation lead or whatever. So in a way, the positioning is a little bit easier, and you have to maybe be less differentiating in a country-specific manner. For a mature product, and that would go back to what was said in the slide, if you have a mature product, you have more competition and you have more local competition. And especially in France and Belgium, people will not, and you do it as well in Ireland, you will tend to favor a French supplier. If there's many suppliers on a product, you will probably favor naturally the French one. So it's very important for a mature product to have a very good value proposition and very distinguishing, to really show what you can do that the others in a mature field can't do. And even if it's a very small thing, even if it's just your added service or something like that. With an innovation, it's much easier. It's a little bit easier to open the door, I would say. And you may have to be less country specific there. But as Enca said, it's a very difficult for us to make a statement for the whole bunch of you of all the companies.
I would add to Jeanne's comment about having a really strong benefits case. So whoever you go to, whether it's a venture team, whether it's an IT services director, prove either quantitatively or qualitatively, but preferably quantitatively, not just why you're better, but the benefit to the business owner.
Perfect. And then in terms of innovation, we've had another question come in. So how open are the local innovation clusters? Like BioWin, for example, towards partnering with non-local companies? So in our context, it would be our Irish companies, our Enterprise Ireland clients.
They're very open, actually. They're very open. I mentioned some of the companies and Enterprise Ireland as well, and BioWin in particular. They were very keen on even starting to share some events where Irish companies and Belgian companies are invited to those events. Funnily enough, as well, BioWin has some sort of connection with Ireland already, so I think yeah, they're very open. And from France, I suppose there's several clusters. So Jeanne probably has a better idea of those clusters. But again, Paul Pharma, which was the first innovation cluster set up in France, we had the opportunity to talk to them as well, and they're very open.
I think you have to remember, especially those there, all about promoting, exchange, business, partnerships. That's really what they're there for. So I think it's something to really leverage, to leverage, attend events, organize things, and I'm sure Enterprise Ireland would be delighted to kind of help in that as well.
And then Suzanne, from a UK perspective, maybe?
I wasn't actually able to talk to anybody like the manufacturing centres of excellence up in Scotland. But I do know that when I spoke to people, because I actually know the ex-head of base launch, and they have entire programs just to introduce new vendors into Switzerland. So this is what you do in your first 90 days. So I think, as I said, both of the markets that I cover are exceptionally international, and as I said, I mean, there's probably 40,000 expats at least in Basel alone. So I think the dynamic of having, I just think innovation is global, and I'm not talking just about digital innovation or digital transformation, but at any point across the value chain, innovation is welcome. Not to say that there aren't conservative parts of the value chain, maybe in sort of rural southern Switzerland, but I think on the whole that these are international markets used to doing international business. And certainly when I looked at the initiatives that are profiled in the main report that went out, most of those aren't Swiss to Swiss partnerships. They will just take the best case. And certainly when I've sat in venture radar teams, unless we specifically want to run a clinical trial or a proof of concept in a local hospital that simply doesn't have an international language capacity, we scan for the best. We don't scan for what's down the road.
Maybe I can add something to that for the UK. Enca and I, for the story, Enca and I are based in the UK, and in the UK you do have OBN, you have one nucleus. They are located in the clusters, and they are organization, and it's the same. The BIA, the British Bioindustry Association. You don't have to be British to become a member. So these are all organizations through which you can get exposure in the UK market by becoming a member. So that I would, if you have the budget, I would encourage you to take memberships on these clusters in the UK. It's slightly different from France and Belgium, where you have to engage with the clusters, but there, if you engage with, it's a bit harder in the UK to engage with the clusters, but there are these associations with whom you can engage. And with OBN, very easy to sponsor events, and really get visibility in the UK. Very, very easy, very straightforward. And large players do that regularly.
I think it's much easier to go through one of the organizations, either that Jan has just mentioned or I've been mentioning in Switzerland, than to turn up to CHPI with 40 or 50,000 presenters who just won't be heard. So I think that kind of more immediate contact is a lot more important.
Yes, I agree with both of you. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. So in terms then coming back to digital transformation and digital in general, so we had a question come in. We are not a technology innovator and digital is not our main business. Are we still relevant?
Of course, of course. There are two things. I mean, as not being a digital innovator doesn't mean that you're not an innovator. And one of the examples that has been given before earlier this morning was, I think, Aerogen, as an Irish company who has their technology has been essential during COVID-19 because it's been able to go into, hospitals and to be able to treat very very poor patients. So in those cases, I would suggest that looking at adjacent fields of application is very important in order to expand your client base. But also, I mentioned that leveraging partnerships is something that we've seen through the pandemic working really well. And one main example, which we've all heard of it, has been BioNTech with Pfizer. And BioNTech on its own wouldn't have been able to take the vaccine to the COVID vaccine to the level of that they've been able to with the help of Pfizer. So in the same way, you may not be developing digital technologies, but looking at potential collaborations or partnerships with some other companies that do offer digital technologies may be your way of rethinking your business strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. But definitely, you're still very relevant.
Yeah, I just want to say, even if you're manufacturing some inserts, for example, that are on the manufacturing chain, well, the manufacturing chain is getting digitalized. So how do you make that easy? Even if your product is just a piece of equipment, which you think is not really relevant, I would say you need to ask yourself the question, how do I fit in? How can I make this digitalization, automation, all these aspects easier for my client? It could just be the way documents are transferred. There are lots of different ways, not just about your product. It's about thinking, how do you fit as a non-digital solution provider in this transforming digital landscape, where it's not just the manufacturing, it's the document, it's the supply chain, it's the client, the delivery, the feedback, the interaction with client, everything is becoming digital. How do you make it easier for your client within that space? And there is a place, there is a way to do that for everybody, even any piece of equipment, even that is not connected to anything electronic. So it's a hard exercise to do, and you probably never thought about it, but I would really encourage you to go through that exercise and see how can we do that, and there are ways. You will find ways, I'm sure.
I think you should also regard technology or digital, we're starting to use them interchangeably, a little bit like COVID. It's an enabler. So you may regard it as a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. Companies want to reduce costs. They want to accelerate. The way you do that is to automate. You may not be the software automator as a company, but you fit, as Jeanne has just said, into the software automation cycle, even if you play a different part of it. And that's to do with the benefits case. So I would consider it an enabler. If digital is not your mainstream business, is how do you ride the wave of opportunity that's being created by digital innovation? So you're not a genomics company, but precision medicine and genomics, machine learning and artificial intelligence is massively accelerating the pace of clinical trials. Where do you fit into that if you're not a genomics player? Of course you still fit in, but just as I think Enca said, think laterally into adjacencies.
Okay, and I'm just conscious of time, so I think perhaps we have time for one more question. And we have one here that is asking, so given the challenge for small innovators to win business with large pharma companies, would it be more reasonable to partner or target some of their key suppliers? If so, what would be the best route to identify those existing suppliers?
I'll answer for the UK, which is don't forget about CDMOs, contract manufacturing, and think more broadly. If you can't get into GSK, GSK has a contract manufacturing organization. So I'm picking one very specific example, but I think, you know, if those companies look really difficult, then there is an entire, I want to use the word ecosystem because we're using it in so many different ways, but there's an entire ecosystem of suppliers that sit around it. That's my first answer in just a minute. So I'll stay.
And I agree with Suzanne. And the second example I would put is, for example, with clinical trials and digitalizing clinical trials and clinical trials operations. If you can't get immediately into the large pharmaceutical companies, they're the clinical research organizations. So it's a similar, so who are the ones supporting those large pharmaceutical companies.
Slightly aware of the profit margins that are involved.
And I would add to that generally for business development, if you're a small company, I would say don't go for big pharma, go for smaller company. I mean, I know it seems like avoiding the questions, but it's so hard and you're gonna have to jump through so many hoops. And I'm not saying exclude the pharma, but I wouldn't target them, the big ones actively. I would do that on the side, and I would focus on smaller size, medium size, small to medium-sized pharma company rather than the big ones. Of course, the big ones are the jackpot, but if you have limited resources, again, it's being pragmatic, limited resources, I would go for something that is more likely to succeed as a primary strategy.
That comes back to use cases. A great use case in a tier 2 company where you can get in and make a fundamental difference will open the door to a larger company, whether it's directly through the reference case or because somebody has moved. And once you're in one of those, particularly in the UK and Switzerland, which are such international markets, you're opening the door to the US, you're opening the door to everywhere. So I would say leverage Ireland to get your Irish affiliates to get into multinationals across Europe, and then think about creating a great proof of concept or reference case in a mid-tier company, and don't target CXOs. It will be so hard to get into their diaries. And find the right level. Find a director who has actually got a budget.
Because the supplier route is tricky, is really tricky. You'd have to be really complementary or really be a very good fit with your supplier, with the supplier of the pharma company. So I don't think that would be my preferred strategy.
Very good. We have to come to a close, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, Suzanne, Enca, and Gianni. Just a quick 4 observations I took from you. Obviously not complete at all, but you know, I like the localize. You know, one size doesn't fit all. You need to have a tailored, localized considerations, including value proposition. You know, if you go for big pharma, there will be more centralized procurement, getting more complex. Going to the procurement people will not necessarily always be helpful. In a way, it's good to focus on the right moment in the life cycle of drug development, and you have to identify and go after the business owners. What's their, you know, like more middle management? What's their incentive, you know, to respond to you, to push for your solution or service, right? Creating a benefit case, you know, not just in digitalization, but in general, will help. These are all mature, sophisticated markets, and so I think Suzanne mentioned the word of mouth, right? How do we get them word of mouth? Obviously, the overseas market advisors are here to support you. We already do work with others, with local organizations, but the membership sort of suggestion, driving that more, showing also more commitment and engagement, I think is a very good step to solidify a market presence and developing your network there. Anyways, time is up. Thank you all very much. Thanks to the team again, and to the audience. I thought the questions were actually quite good complement to your good report, and you will hear from us regarding additional sort of summaries and material we do on this. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you all, Suzanne, Enca, Jean, and Vincennes, and Glenn, of course, who kept us on the straight and narrow. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.